Okay, in this video, we're going to be having a look at the data validation feature in Excel. So under the data option in the menu, you'll see this option is here, data validation. So let me explain to you what it does. Data validation basically does a check that when you enter any data into any particular cell, it will validate whether the data is, as it says, valid, depending on the rules that you set. So it's best explained with an example. So let's assume you were giving the spreadsheet to somebody else to enter, or even if you were entering it yourself, you know that when somebody comes into this particular column, for example, the performance grade, you can see that the performance grade is a letter from A to F. So A, B, C, D, E, or F. And those are the only valid entries that you expect in this particular column. So if somebody enters in another letter like a Z or tries to enter in a full word, it should basically reject that input and actually give the user a notice that the only valid inputs are a letter from A to F. So that would be an example of data validation. Similarly, the region here is one of the provinces, and if somebody comes in and enters in here, they should only be able to select one of the provinces or enter in one of the province names. They shouldn't basically be able to just enter any wording in here, because this particular column is only for the region, and the way we have defined it is it's one of the province names. So let's look at how one would do that. Let's use this example first of the performance grade. So we go to data validation. So I'm on this cell. I'm going to set up data validation for this particular cell first, and I'll show you later how you can actually copy it across. So I go and I click on data validation, and you'll see there's three different tabs. So there's a settings tab, an input message, and an error alert. Right, so let's start off with the settings. So the default setting says in this particular cell, you can allow any value, and that's what the normal setting is on all of the cells before you set up any data validation. So if I click on this drop down, you can see I can maybe only allow whole numbers. So for example, let's actually look at the whole number example with something like a salary, right? Let's assume that for salaries, we only wanted to allow whole numbers without decimals. So if I went onto that cell and I said clicked on data validation, and on here I only allowed a whole number, right? You can even tell it between any particular numbers, right? So you can say I'll have a whole number only between 0, or let's assume that the minimum salary, for example, is 20,000. So we don't want any number lower than 20,000, and let's say the maximum we assume for the basic salary for a salesperson is 100,000 for argument's sake. And if I say okay, right, now what happens is if somebody basically enters in say 21,000 and enter on that cell, there'll be no issue. But let's say they enter in 18,000, immediately it will say this value doesn't match the data validation restrictions. So it's giving you a very generic message. It doesn't actually explain the 18 and 20,000. So we want to change this message, which I'll show you how to do it a little bit later. But it goes back to the previous value of 21,000. If I type in something like 80,000, which is still in the range, that'll be fine. But if I type in 120,000, again, it's going to give me that message, and it won't allow this value to be entered. I'd have to click cancel. Right, now the first thing we would actually say is, while I'm on this point, remember it's for a number. So if I typed in a text, like I just typed in the word test, it won't accept any text either. It's only going to accept a whole number, and it also won't accept any decimals. So if I had 50,000 and I put 0.01, it's not going to work either. So it gives you this error message. It says this value doesn't match the data validation restrictions defined for the cell. So what we can do is if I click on the data validation again, you can see now the rule for this particular cell is a whole number between 20,000 and 100,000. So what I can actually do when somebody is on the cell, here's the first issue. When somebody clicks on the cell and they're entering in a value, they don't even know that there's a data validation on the cell. You can't actually see it. It's not obvious. It is stored behind the scenes in Excel, but there's nothing on this particular cell that says anything. Remember, earlier on we only did the validation on this cell. So on this particular cell below it, just currently, I could type in anything. I could type in anything there. I could even type in 120,000. I could add decimals. There's no data validation here. But when you look at these two cells, you can't tell the difference. So in order to prevent that from happening, on the data validation option here, you go to the input message, and here you can put an input message. So you can type in here, enter basic salary as the title, and you can say enter an amount between 20,000 and 100,000 without decimals. So you give an instruction so that somebody that's basically going to be on that cell will know what it is. So when I click on OK, you can immediately see this yellow box appearing here, and it gives you a message telling the user what they need to do. So enter basic salary, enter an amount between 20,000 and 100,000 without decimals. When I click on this cell, there's no message here because there's no data validation that's been set up. Of course, if I copy this down, if I say Control C and I copy this to the next cell, it copied the 80,000, the value, but it copied it with validation. If I delete that cell, right, and I go back to it, even though it's blank, the validation is still there and this message is still there. All right, now if the person basically enters in a wrong value, let's say they enter in a test, right, it's giving this error message that says this value doesn't match the data validation restrictions. Now you can change this error message, and let's look at where you would do that. So again, we can click on the data validation. Remember, we did the input message, which was this yellow. That's the input message over there, the yellow box. We initially started off with the settings, which said what is the validation. Now, the third thing, when somebody enters in a wrong number or something that isn't accepted, that's the error alert that will appear. Now, you can actually tick this off. So if I tick this off and I say OK, right, now if somebody types in something here, right, you can see there is no error alert. It's just basically accepting it. If I copy this down and I say, okay, 90,000, and I put in the .01, again, it's not actually doing anything. So let's highlight all three of these again, and let's click on data validation, and we're gonna, okay, let's do this. I will actually just work on this one for now, and let's click on data validation, and you can see I'm going to do the error alert, and on the alert we're going to say error, right, you must enter a whole number between 20,000 and 100,000, right? And I'll say okay. Right now it doesn't give you the error message immediately because this value was already entered there, right? But if I basically double click it and I try to re-enter in, if I hit the enter now, you can see that error message comes up. You must enter a whole number between 20,000 and 100,000. So this validation, this error message that we put is much more better than the default one that was appearing. Because this actually explains exactly what the error is. All right, so that's how you would basically do an error message. So going back into the data validation, we've now covered the settings, which is the initial validation. What are we allowing in this particular cell? And in this case, we're allowing a whole number. Later on, we're going to look at all the other options. So the validation doesn't only have to be a whole number. We can actually say it allows a decimal number, and we'll look at all of these different options such as lists, dates, and so forth. And then we looked at the input message, which is when somebody clicks on the cell, the yellow box that appears over here, just basically giving them information as to what to input. And this is quite important because this is the only indication when somebody clicks on a cell, especially for numbers, that there is in fact a data validation rule that's being applied to the cell. So if you don't put this input message, they may not know at all that there's a data validation rule. And then the error alert is quite important in that it actually gives them a more better explanation when they enter an invalid number or an invalid input into the cell. One more final thing I want to show you is that the style here is a stop, right? It's saying that you don't allow them to continue, but you can put a warning. So a warning basically, and I could just change this title to say warning, although you don't have to. Now let's look at what the difference is of a warning. In a warning, let's say somebody typed in here 120,000, right? Now with a warning, it says you must enter a number between 20,000 and 100,000. But the difference between a warning and an error is a warning allows you to continue. So I can still override it and say, no, I do want 120,000 in there. So it's just a warning. Whereas with an error, coming back to it, when this thing was selected as error, if I clicked on this drop down, the stop basically gives you that error message, but the stop won't allow somebody to continue. Whereas a warning gives you an option to basically continue and override the rule. It's just warning you, you should enter a number, but if you insist that you want to enter something that's not actually fitting in with the data validation rule, it will allow you to continue. And then the third option is just basically for information, right? So in information, And I'll just type in your info, although this is just the title on the top that displays. And the difference with information is, let's just type in some text. It just says you must enter a whole number between 20,000 and 100,000, and if you click on OK, it'll just accept it. So a warning doesn't even have that yes no option. It just says it just basically gives you a warning, and then but whatever you typed in, right, and you say the moment you say OK, it just continues and accepts it. So that gives you a basic introduction to data validation. We did the data validation using a number, and in a follow-on video we'll look at the other options.